In this video, we're going to be refactoring app.js, taking a lot of the complex logic related to geocoding and moving it into a separate file. Currently, all of the logic for making the request and determining whether or not the request succeeded, our if-else statements, live inside of app.js. This is not exactly reusable and it really doesn't belong here. What I'd like to do before we add even more logic related to fetching the forecast, that's the topic of the next video, is break this out into its own function. This function is going to live in a separate file like we did for the Notes application. In the Notes app, we had a separate file that had functions for adding, listing, and removing notes from our local JSON file. We're going to be creating a separate function responsible for geocoding a given address. Although the logic is going to stay the same, there really is no way around it. It's just going to be abstracted out of the app.js file and into its own location. Now, this is going to be the challenge for the video. We're going to start with a challenge, and in the end of the video, we'll add a few more advanced features to the function. But for now, I'm going to tell you what I'd like you to do. First up, you are going to need to create a new directory and a new file for this challenge. I'm not going to actually create the directory or file. That's part of the challenge, but I will show you what the require statement is going to look like. We're going to load in via a constant variable called geocode, the module. Require // since we're requiring a local file, we're going to add that relative path, geocode / geocode.js. That means you need to make a directory called geocode in the weather app folder and a file called geocode.js. Since we have a .js extension, we can actually leave it off of our require call. Down below, what you need to do is call geocode.geocode address. Geocode address, that is going to be the function responsible for all of the logic we currently have in app.js. Geocode address is going to take the address, argv.address. It's going to be responsible for doing everything, encoding the URL, making the request, and handling all of the error cases. This means in that new file, you need to export the geocode address function, just like we exported functions from the Notes application file. Down below, we have all of the logic here. This logic needs to get moved inside of that function. Everything I have highlighted should not be in the app.js file after the challenge has been completed. Now you can copy and paste this directly. There really is no way around some of the more complex logic, but you are going to need to make a few changes. You're going to need to load request into that new file since we use it, and it isn't going to be required in that file by default. Then you can go ahead and clean up the request require call here since we won't be using it in this file. Next up, the argv object is not going to exist. You're going to get that passed in via the first argument, just like I have shown right here. That means you're going to need to swap this out for whatever you happen to call that first argument. I'd recommend calling that first argument something like address. When you're done, the program should work exactly as it works now. There should be no change in functionality. So take a moment, create the folder, create the file, require request, create that geocode address function, copying all the code below, and export it. Then make that quick change, changing this to whatever you happen to call that first argument. When you're done, test things out. Try a valid address and make sure you get the address, latitude, and longitude, and try an invalid zip code, and make sure unable to find that address prints to the screen. Then go ahead and click play. How'd it go? Hopefully you were able to create that file and get everything up and running. To get started, I'm going to make a brand new directory in Weather App. That's the first thing we need to do. The directory is called geocode, which aligns with the require statement I have above. In geocode, we're going to make our file, geocode.js. New file, geocode.js. Now inside of here, we can get started by loading in request. Let's make a constant called request. And we'll set it equal to require request. Excellent. Now we can go ahead and define the function responsible for geocoding. This one will be called geocode address. I'm going to make a variable called geocode address, setting it equal to an arrow function. And this arrow function is going to get an address argument passed in. This is the plain text unencoded address. Now, before we copy the code from app.js into this function body, I want to export our geocode address function using module.exports, which we know is an object. Anything we put on this object is going to be available to any files that require this file. In our case, we want to make a geocode address property available, setting it equal to the geocode address function that we defined up above. Excellent. Now it's time to actually copy all of the code from app.js into geocode.js. I'm going to highlight everything here, cut it out using Command X, move into geocode.js, and paste it inside of the body of our function. The only thing we need to change inside of here is how we get the plain text address. We no longer have that argv object. Instead, we get the address passed in as an argument. Excellent. With this in place, we're now done with the geocode file. It contains all of the complex logic for making and finishing the request. Over in app.js, we can clean things up by removing some extra spaces and removing the request module, which is no longer used in this file. Now at this point, the functionality should be exactly the same, and this is all you needed to do for the challenge. Over inside of the terminal, you were supposed to run a few examples to make sure it worked. I'm going to go ahead and run a few to confirm my changes worked. I'll use the A flag to search for a zip code that does exist, something like 19147. And here we go. I can see the address, the latitude, and the longitude. Now I'm going to swap out that zip code for something that does not exist, like 00000. When I run this through the geocoder, you can see unable to find address prints to the screen. And that's fantastic. It means all of the logic inside of geocode.js is still working. This is all you needed to do for the challenge. Now, the next step in the process, and the step I'll walk you through, is the process of adding a callback function to geocode address. Now, the goal of refactoring the code in app.js was not to get rid of the callback. The goal was to abstract all of the complex logic related to encoding the data, making the request, and checking for errors. App.js should not care about any of that. It doesn't even need to know that an HTTP request was ever made. All the app.js should care about is passing an address to the function and doing something with the result. The result being either an error message or the data, the formatted address, the latitude, and the longitude. Before we go ahead and make any changes in geocode.js, I want to take a look at how we're going to structure things over here inside of app.js. We're going to pass a function to geocode address. It's going to be an arrow function, and this is going to get called after the request comes back. In here, we're going to expect two arguments, error message, which is going to be a string, and results, which is going to contain the address, the latitude, and the longitude. Only one of these is going to be available at a time. If we have an error message, we're not going to have results, and if we have results, we're not going to have an error message. This is going to make the logic down below of determining whether or not the call succeeded much simpler. We'll be able to use an if statement, if error message, and if there is an error message, we can simply print it to the screen using console.log. Console.log error message. There's no need to dig into any sort of object and figure out exactly what's going on. All of that logic is abstracted in geocode.js. Now, if there is no error message inside of the else clause, we can go ahead and print the results. I'm going to use that pretty print method we talked about previously. Console.log json.stringify. And we're going to pretty print the results object, which will be an object containing an address property, a latitude property, and a longitude property. In here, I'm going to pass the undefined argument as our second argument. This skips over the filtering function, which we don't need, and then I can specify my spacing, which is going to format this in a really nice way. I'm going to use 2 spaces right here. Now that we have our function set up over inside of geocode address and we have a good idea about how it's going to look, we can go ahead and implement it over inside of geocode.js. In our arguments definition, instead of just expecting an address argument, we're also going to expect a callback argument. And we can call this callback argument whenever we like. We're going to call it in 3 places. We're going to call it once inside of this if block. Instead of calling console.log, we're simply going to call the callback with this string. This string is going to be the error message right here. In order to do this, all we need to do is change our console.log call to a callback call, passing as the first argument our error message. We can take the string exactly as it appeared in console.log and move it into the arguments for callback. Then I can remove the console.log call and save the file. Now we can do the exact same thing down below for our other console.log statement when there is 0 results. I'm going to replace console.log with callback. Now the last one is going to be a little trickier. It's a little trickier because we don't exactly have our object, and we also need to create an undefined variable for the first argument, since an error message is not going to be provided when things go well. All we have to do to create that undefined error message is call callback, passing in undefined as the first argument. Then we can go ahead and specify our object as the second argument, and this object, this is going to be exactly what's right here, the results. Now, as I mentioned, the results, it's going to have 3 properties. The first one is going to be formatted address, so let's go ahead and knock that out first. I'm going to set address equal to body.results, just like we have here. I'm going to grab the first item dot formatted underscore address. Here we're making things even easier, and instead of having complex properties that are nested deep inside of an object, inside of app.js, we'll be able to access a simple address property. And we're going to do the same thing for latitude and longitude. Down below, I'm going to grab the code that let us fetch the latitude, and I'm going to add my second property, latitude, setting it equal to the code I grabbed below. Then we can go ahead and add the last property, which is going to be longitude, setting that equal to the latitude code, replacing LAT with LNG. Now that we have this in place, we can add a semicolon at the end and remove the console.log statements since they're no longer necessary. And with this, we are done. We can now rerun the file, and when we do, we're going to pass an address to geocode address. This is going to go off and make the request, and when the request comes back, we'll be able to handle that response in a really simple way. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to go back 2 commands to run the command where I used the zip of 19147. Everything works as expected. Right here, you can see I have my results object with an address property, a latitude property, and a longitude property. Everything looks fantastic. The last test is going to be to test what happens when I pass in a bad zip code. I just want to make sure the error message still shows up, and it does. Unable to find that address prints to the screen, and that is happening because of this if statement right here. We check if there is an error message, and if there is, we print it to the screen. After abstracting all of that logic to the geocode file, app.js is now a lot simpler and a lot easier to maintain. We can also call geocode address in multiple locations. If we want to reuse the code, we don't have to copy and paste the code, which would not follow the dry principle, which stands for don't repeat yourself. Instead, we can do the dry thing and simply call geocode address like we have here. With this in place, we are now done fetching the geocode data. In the next video, we're going to start wiring up that forecast API, fetching real-time weather data for the address we geocoded. Stay tuned. I am super excited to get to that. I will see you next time.